Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you've never seen, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
All right. We are at season 4, episode 1.
We're back.
Had that nice little bonus episode during the hiatus, which I unfortunately was not able to be there for, but it turned out really awesome. That was a super cool discussion you had.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation. When you find another nerd that is that has the same Venn diagram as you do, and it just overlaps so far.
Yeah.
It was great.
I really liked when he asked your approach to researching each episode because, it's funny. I think that's something that we haven't even talked about between the two of us because I think both of us have different approaches when we research episodes. And it was kind of cool to be like, I never even thought to ask about that, but it was cool to hear that little bit of discussion.
Yeah, I had nothing against anything that you had researched before. And part of it is like, you're going into Star Wars. And the thing is that most people know Star Wars. And you'll notice if ever we cover a subject that most people aren't absolutely knowledgeable about, like you'll actually go into the backgrounds of. So like,
yeah.
You have that intuition already.
Yeah. I think for me, and I think it's partly because so far I've only done episodes where people are very, very aware of the backstory. I feel like for me, I always think of like, who's the main character of this story? Let's talk about Rick McCallum. Let's talk about Kathleen Kennedy and find a main character and then build out from there.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from us listening to The Dollop, where even though it covers one subject that may be problematic, so like MK Ultra, it wasn't just MK Ultra and just the experiments alone. They actually did a follow through of like just one person and like following their career as they like intertwine, intermix, and like influence all of that. And I feel like because we're aware of that, it creates a much more interesting story when you have one person or like one idea that you can follow.
Absolutely.
But we're going to be going into a huge hit.
Oh, yeah.
We're starting off season 4 really strong. We are covering probably one of the most, if not the most popular unmade movie of all time.
First of all, I was shocked that you had not heard about this when it came up on our emails episode.
I was very unaware of it. I know like thumbing through the book, and because I have the book there, like I saw Dune was on there. For me, I just saw it as like, oh, that's just one of many that have not been made. I did not know the magnitude of this movie.
And kind of like the magnitude of how it exists in the popular zeitgeist. For a lot of people, this is something that a lot of people see as like, this would have been game-changing. This is fundamental to film history. And something that I'm sure we'll get into that is a big theme of the documentary, something that we've discovered on this podcast a lot is that the movies that don't get made still affect the progression of film history. There's ideas, there's connections, there's things like that happen during these movies that even though they don't actually get made, they still have an impact on the progression of film and the types of movies that do get made and everything. And I feel like this is the perfect case study for this because this really starts so much of the direction that filmmaking would go in, especially sci-fi in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Before we actually get into the subject here, I kind of want to ask, like, what is your personal history with Dune?
I read the book when I was in high school. I was trying to read a lot of sci-fi books, but for whatever reason, Dune is not something that really stuck with me. I remember that was one I was specifically listening to the audiobook for, and there were just long sections of that book where I just like tuned out a little bit. There's a lot going on in that book. There's a lot of politics that I wasn't really grasping at the time. Even though I read it, I did not remember hardly anything about it except for like some of the names and the fact that there's a big sandworm and there's spice, and like basically all I remembered are the things that exist in popular culture. I didn't really think about it too much, but then I saw the Denis Villeneuve movie that came out this past year, which I really enjoyed. And that was like, oh yeah, I kind of remember the Bene Gesserit and all of this stuff. I know one of the things we're going to talk about is the nature of adapting a work like this and how true you stick to the adaptation. It really seemed to me, based off of the way people were talking about it, that Denis Villeneuve's Dune is the equivalent of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, where it is incredibly faithful. And not just to the events, but to the themes, to the style. I'm really fascinated by Dune and have like read and listened to a lot of people talking about Dune who are really, really into the books and have a lot of strong opinions. And so I feel like a lot of my perception of Dune is definitely colored by other people's readings of it. There's definitely going to be quite a few times during this podcast where I'll be like, well, I'm pretty sure, this happens in Dune, or this is what Dune is about, or that's a theme. A lot of that is going to come from me not having read the books and just parroting what I've heard other people say. So take anything I say about Dune with a grain of salt.
You mean a grain of sand?
Yes, exactly. A grain of spice. What's your history with Dune, Dan?
Well, I had little to no knowledge of Dune. Now I feel like I'm a scholar in it. But I did not read the books growing up. It's in the zeitgeist. Like, I knew that it was important.
Yes.
And that was really about it. Like, I knew that it was a big sci-fi book.
Is it fair to say that Dune is for sci-fi what Lord of the Rings is for fantasy?
Yeah.
It's like a fundamental work of fiction of the genre and probably the starting point for a lot of people. I guess sci-fi has a couple of other things because you got like Asimov stuff, you've got Ray Bradbury stuff. So
with Lord of the Rings and with Dune, and I explained this with my roommate, and she was asking like, what was the importance of Dune? And I said it was like how Lord of the Rings is important to fantasy. Even though Lord of the Rings is not the first, Dune is not the first, it is really what put those genres on the map. That is what made it seem like this is an important work of fiction.
There's a lot of sci-fi that I got into that I feel like takes a lot of inspiration from Dune. For one, Star Wars, the Sand Planet, and the talking about spice, there's definitely a lot of Dune in Star Wars. My favorite book series growing up was Ender's Game and that whole series and the Ender's Shadow series. And I feel like that series, especially the Shadow series, deals a lot with the intersection of politics and sci-fi. And I guess the Ender's Game series deals with a lot of the intersection of like philosophy and religion and sci-fi. And all of that is very, very heavy thematically in Dune. Dune is not just about a space adventure. It is about political families. It is about religion and the way that religion is used to control people or to spread a message or to prop up colonialism. It seems to me like the sci-fi before Dune, stuff like Ray Bradbury stuff, was like speculative and just like, okay, let's introduce this kind of technology and kind of view how this technology would affect people, or this being on Mars would affect people with stuff like the Martian Chronicles. But Dune feels like the sci-fi aspect is more of a setting than it is a theme, where the theme has a lot more to do with politics that we recognize on Earth.
Yeah. And it's politics that we still recognize today, because something that or at least Frank Herbert gets into, is the ecological side of it all. This idea that you are basically in a desert planet where you are mining out the materials, which is harming those who live on that planet.
Yeah, which is what we see with water protectors and like the Standing Rock protests a couple of years ago, and like how indigenous people in America who are like the biggest voices in ecological protection.
Yeah. The first thing that I went to was oil in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Like, it is a perfect allegory for that.
Yeah, 100%.
To start off everything, I do want to start off with Frank Herbert and just a little bit about who he is and where he came from.
Okay.
Frank Herbert was born in Tacoma, Washington on October 8th, 1920. From an early age, he was fascinated by books and developed a keen sense of quick learning and memorization. Herbert was also taken with photography. At the age of 10, he bought himself a Kodak box camera. In his teens, he got a folding camera and soon upgraded to a color film camera. When the Great Depression hit, his family became impoverished. In a state of desperation, he ran away from home and moved with his auntie and uncle in Salem, Oregon. There, he enrolled in Salem High School and graduated in 1939. His first job was working for a newspaper, the Glendale Star, in which he had to lie about his age to get it. In 1940, he transferred to the Oregon Statesman newspaper, where he would take on various jobs, including photography. Now, in 1941, Frank moved to San Pedro, California, where he married Flora Lillian Parkinson and had a daughter, Penelope. In 1942, when the U.S. was entering World War II, he served in the Navy's Seabees for 6 months as a photographer. After a significant head injury, he was medically discharged. After that, he and his wife divorced in 1943, and he moved up to Portland, Oregon. There, he was a reporter for the Oregon Journal. After the war, Herbert went back to school and attended the University of Washington. In 1943 is where he would meet his future wife in his creative writing class, Beverly Ann Stewart. They connected over the fact that they were the only two students who were able to sell and get their work published. Beverly sold a story to Modern Romance magazine, and Frank sold an adventure story to Esquire. In the same year, they got married and moved to Seattle, Washington. Together, they had 2 sons, Brian and Bruce. Frank never graduated from college and only went to study subjects he was interested in. I remember Steve Jobs. He was asked to be a speaker at a graduation ceremony, which I feel like is not the greatest person to have at a graduation ceremony, seeing that he never actually graduated.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know if you know his story, but he actually started dropping in on classes. I forget, it was like an imaging class that he was dropping in on, and it was like formatting and how to format a page or anything for like a newspaper or like type lettering and stuff like that. And it was that helped him format the word processor for the Mac. But he never paid for any classes. He stayed on someone's couch, and that was the only class he was interested in, and he just walked into the lecture for free. And then he just walked away from it. So not the greatest person for graduation ceremonies.
Yeah.
But if you're looking to get educated, just walk into a college and just don't say anything. Especially big lecture halls, they don't take any attendance. In 1949, Frank and Beverly moved to California to work for the Press Democrat in Santa Rosa. While living, they were befriended by psychologists Frank and Irene Slattery. The two introduced them to several progressive, or at least at the time, thinkers like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Karl Jasper, and Martin Heidegger, who would later be influential to Herbert's writing. Also around this time, he was introduced to Zen Buddhism. Herbert didn't get into science fiction until around the 50s. His first story, Looking for Something, was published in the April 1952 issue of Startling Stories. In 1954, his story, Operation Syndrome and Pack Rat Planet, was published in 2 issues of Astounding Science Fiction, and his story, The Gone Dogs, was published in an issue of The Amazing Stories.
All right.
Throughout the years after that, Herbert became prolific in publishing multiple sci-fi stories, which would lead up to him writing his first novel, The Dragon of the Sea. It started off as an ongoing series in Astounding magazine from 1955 to 56 and was compiled together and published as a standalone book. The novel was well received. Reviewer Floyd C. Gielid claimed that the book was, quote, a dramatically fascinating story, a tense and well-written novel. Although it was criticized by Spider Robinson, I don't know if that's a real name, but if I can name my kid Spider, I will. But he said that there are no real people in it, only psychological types and syndromes walking around on legs. The story was pretty forward-thinking, predicting worldwide conflicts over oil consumption and production. So we're kind of getting the seeds here.
Yeah.
In 1959, Herbert traveled to Florence, Oregon, a city located on the north end of the Oregon Dunes. There, he was researching the ecosystem of how the U.S. Department of Agriculture was using poverty grass to help stabilize the dunes to avoid the dunes from eroding and, quote, swallowing whole cities, lakes, rivers, and highways. According to Frank's article, they stopped the moving sands. During his stay in Oregon, Herbert was interested in the idea of a superhero mystique and messiahs, and how many origin stories of messiahs and religious leaders began in the desert. He was also interested in exploring the idea of feudalism and wanted to base an idea that would combine the two ideas. Now, he was fortunate to extend his stay with the financial help of his wife, who was actually working as a copywriter for department stores. Frank Herbert would take his inspiration from many stories. The first drawing heavily from the story of T.E. Lawrence's involvement in the Arab Revolt during World War I.
Yes. I've seen that movie.
Oh, yeah. In an early draft, it actually drew way too many parallels to Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
Herbert changed the plot to make the story more layered. Another inspiration was Leslie Blanch's The Sabers of Paradise, a narrative story about the conflict between the Islamic tribes and the Russian Empire. Another inspiration was Herbert's experience with psilocybin. According to mycologist Paul Stamens, after meeting Frank in the 80s, he said, quote, Frank went on to tell me that much of the premise of Dune, the magical spice, or spores, that allowed the bending of space, which is just tripping, the giant sandworms, which is maggots digesting mushrooms, the eyes of the Fremen, which is the blue of the cyboscillin mushrooms, and the mysticism of the female spiritual warriors, the Bene Gesserits, which influenced the tales of the mushrooms, influenced by the tales of Maria Sabina and the sacred mushroom cults of Mexico, came from the perception of the fungal life cycle, and his imagination was stimulated through his experience with the use of magic mushrooms. So Dune is just a long mushroom trip. Herbert spent 5 years doing research and working on his book. To get his story published, it was an uphill battle. First, he published a 3-part serial titled Dune World in the magazine Analog from December 1963 to February 1964. Then published a 5-part serial titled The Prophet of Dune from January to May of 1965. At the time, Analog's editor was John W. Campbell, who wrote a novella called Who Goes There?, which was actually adapted into a movie 3 times, all under the title The Thing.
Oh.
To sell the book as a novel, the first 3 parts were combined in the title Book 1, Dune. The Prophet of Dune was separated into 2 books and were titled Book 2, Muad'Dib, and Book 3, The Prophet. The story was revised and explained before it was submitted to 22 publishers, who all rejected the novels. It wasn't until the transcript fell into the hands of Sterling Lanier that he thought that there was potential in the book. At the time, he was an editor at Chilton Books, who was best known for publishing auto repair manuals. He urged the company to take a risk and got the book published in August 1965. The sticker price for the first printing was $5.95, which doesn't seem that bad, but remember that it is 1965.
Yeah.
Adjusted for inflation, that's basically buying a book for over $50 today.
Oh my goodness.
The exact calculation is $53.11.
Wow.
Yeah. So the book didn't sell very well and was poorly reviewed by critics, seeing that it's just another atypical sci-fi story. Chilton Books used the cost of publishing Dune as a write-off and promptly fired Sterling.
Wow.
Over time, the book gained popularity through word of mouth, enough so that it allowed Herbert to work on the sequels full-time. It won a Hugo and Nebula Award and was being compared to J.R.R. Tolkien for what he did to fantasy books. Frank Herbert did to science fiction. So yes, we were correct in that assumption.
Yeah.
The seed of making the book into a movie has been around since around the early 70s. The thought of adapting the book into a film was unimaginable. Epic battle scenes, a character that effortlessly floats in the air, giant sandworms. It seemed impossible or incredibly expensive to make. So for Joe Ford and Bob Greenhut, they looked to make this happen when they completed their 83-page treatment in March of 1972.
It seems to me, beyond just the effects, I think there's also an issue of Dune has a lot of characters, has a lot of new terminology.
Know then that it is the year 10,191. The known universe is ruled by the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, my father.
Has a lot of things that are just like don't really flow very easily in a 3-act structure movie, which granted at the time, movies weren't as heavily defined by that 3-act structure that they are now, but it's still a lot of information to keep track of.
Yeah, it's a lot of information, and it seemed like, because this is going into the 70s, you wanted to keep like a lot of movies compact into like one narrative. The idea of even a sequel or a franchise even, it seems so far out there.
Yeah. The idea of a franchise is not a thing that people were thinking about.
And The Godfather it actually came out that year, 1972. So the sequel wasn't even realized at that part. To produce this epic sci-fi movie, Greenhut lobbied for Arthur P. Jacobs, the head of Apjac International, to take on the film. Jacobs managed to secure the rights to Dune in August 1972. According to the contract, he had about 9 years to make the film before the contract expired. He seemed to be the best producer behind this IP because he previously produced another sci-fi powerhouse film, Planet of the Apes.
Oh, is this when there were Planet of the Apes as a franchise?
Almost, because when he obtained the rights for Dune, he was actually currently working on the Planet Apes sequel, which then delayed the production or the pre-production for Dune for about a year.
Okay.
God damn you all to hell!
So to put together this epic film, Jacobs offered the job to director David Lean and writer Robert Bolt.
That makes a lot of sense.
They both worked together on Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago.
Yeah, I haven't seen Dr. Zhivago, but it seems obvious to hire somebody who did Lawrence of Arabia to do Dune.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that as well because I don't think of David Lean as a genre director. I think of him as a historical director. He did movies like Bridge on the River Kwai as well. And I think that would have been a really interesting take to basically take this movie and view it through the lens of this is a part of history we are telling, not this space adventure.
Yeah. And I figure that, he's worked in the desert, people with blue eyes. He's got this down.
Yeah.
It is recognized that you have a funny sense of fun.
But Lean, he did turn down the offer, and Bolt then soon left after him. After he turned down the offer to Jacobs, after that, Jacobs did consider Charles Jarrott, who directed Anne of the Thousand Days.
Oh, okay. I've not seen that.
I have not seen that either. But those plans fell through as well. Even without a director in mind, pre-production moved forward with plans to begin filming in 1974 in Jerome, Turkey, with a $15 million budget.
Wow. That's a big budget for this time, right?
Yeah, it's pretty big. Movies were anywhere from $1 million to maxing out $10 million.
Yeah.
Although we'll get into a few other comparisons.
Okay.
We'll understand that better.
So we're in the early 70s right now.
Yes.
What year did the book come out again?
The book came out in 1965.
Okay. So this is pretty soon after the book has been out and they're trying to capitalize on its success and cultural moment.
Yeah. This is around the time that it became successful.
Yeah.
In November 1972, Rospo Pallenberg, who wrote Excalibur in 1981, he was hired to write the first draft. And by January 1973, he submitted a 72-page treatment. Based on the treatment, they scaled back the budget to $7 million. Now, unfortunately, on June 27th, 1973, Arthur Jacobs died of a heart attack. As for the rights of Dune, it was tied up in his estate. Apjac International decided against pursuing the film and gave up the rights in 1974. By December of 1974, the baton was passed on to executive producers of Camera One, Jean-Paul Gibbon and Michael Seydoux, to direct, they got experimental Chilean-born French director Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Before you go any further, I think it's pronounced Jodorowsky because he's from Mexico.
Okay. I've been going back and forth on that.
In the documentary, I'm pretty sure they say Jodorowsky a couple of times, but then there's some of the European people, like the producers, say Jodorowsky. So it kind of seems like it's all over the place a little bit, but...
I've heard so many pronunciations of it. I think during the discussion, I called him Jodorowsky.
Okay.
So Alejandro Jodorowsky, known for his cult classic movies El Topo and The Holy Mountain. In fact, Yoko Ono and John Lennon claimed that one of their favorite movies was El Topo.
Wow.
Jodorowsky, on the other hand, claims he wanted to make Dune, like that was his decision, because it came to him as a vision and a dream. So the next day, he read the whole book in one sitting, called up Michael Sodou, who helped finance the distribution of Jodorowsky's previous mentioned movies. He would let him know what the next movie would be, and soon after, Sodou got the rights to the book. Now, there seems to be a lot of many contradicting stories about Jodorowsky's Dune, because Alejandro seems to be a real-life, unreliable narrator.
I was definitely getting that vibe from the documentary.
Yeah.
There were some of the stories he would tell that it's like, there's no way that that's really how that happened.
There were so many coincidences in the story.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, I don't actually know how much of this is really true.
Well, we'll get into that.
Yeah. According to Ben Cobb's book, Anarchy in Anarchy, in 1974, Jodorowsky and another producer, Alan Klein, another distributor of El Topo, producer of The Holy Mountain, and the manager of the Beatles, had disagreements on what Jodorowsky's next film should be. So according to the book, Jodorowsky was planning on making a movie called Mr. Blood and Miss Bones, a children's pirate movie, as in it would be cast entirely with children. I don't know if it would have been appropriate for children, though.
Okay.
And based on the story of St. Brendan the Navigator. He wanted the film on location in New York, where they would paint the buildings blue to look like the ocean and tow a pirate ship through the streets to make it look like they were floating in the sea. Apparently, Alan Klein didn't have the pull to make this happen. And then Klein, on the other hand, wanted to capitalize on the exploding pornography business and was looking to produce adult films himself. His first film was going to be an adaptation of Pauline Roget's erotic story of O, in which he wanted Jodorowsky to direct. But Jodorowsky instead fled from London, not telling Klein at all. So I was going through, and I was going to go into the story of the production itself. And it seemed like a lot of this has to do with like how Jodorowsky acts.
Okay.
So instead of going directly into that story, we're going to have two backstories here. We are going to have Frank Herbert and we are going to have Alejandro Jodorowsky. So we're going to learn just a little bit about him.
Okay.
I will say just the first little bit, there is a content warning here. There is mention of sexual abuse, at least just the first section of it. Much like Frank Herbert, he had a complicated background before becoming an established filmmaker. Alejandro was born in 1929 in Tocopilla, Chile, to two Jewish immigrant parents. His father was a merchant who ran a shop with his mother. His father was abusive and one time accused his wife of flirting with a customer, which led to him beating and raping her and getting her pregnant with their son, Alejandro. His mother resented his father, and because of their circumstance, he recalls his mother telling him, "I cannot love you," and refused to care for their child. His whole childhood growing up, he felt rejected, whether it be from the Americans who ran the mining companies in Chile at the time, who were notorious for treating Chilean locals terribly, and from locals who knew that he was a son of Jewish immigrants. He never felt like he had a place where he belonged. At 9 years old, he was forced to leave, and he and his family moved to Santiago, Chile. Alejandro found an escape in reading. He loved to read and started writing poetry. By the time he was 16 years old, he got one of his poems published. He attended the University of Chile, where he studied psychology and philosophy for 2 years before dropping out. Alejandro became interested in theater and mime techniques and found a job as a clown for a circus, which helped jumpstart his career in theater directing. In 1947, he found his own theatrical troupe, the Teatro Mimico, And by 1952, the troupe grew to over 50 members. In 1953, he wrote his first play. I can't pronounce that, but in English, it's translated to The Minotaur.
Okay.
After feeling that he could not expand his career in the arts any further in Chile, he decided to move to Paris. When in Paris, Jodorowsky continued to study mime with Etienne de Creux, where he joined the troupe of one of the other students, Marcel Marceau. While the troupe was on tour, he came up with many memorable routines, which included the cage, which is basically like the box, and the mask maker, which is when like you see someone with like a happy face, they put their hand and swipe it over their face and they're like immediately sad and they swipe it back up and it's happy again. So he basically created those two routines, which has been made famous by Marcel Marceau.
Yeah.
He would later return back to directing theater, where he worked with Maurice Cavalier and his music hall comeback. In 1953, this is the first time that Jodorowsky first dabbled in filmmaking, when he made a 20-minute adaptation of Thomas Mann's novella, The Transposed Heads, a film that almost entirely was told through mime. The film was nearly lost until it was recovered in 2006. In 1960, Alejandro moved to Mexico City, but would occasionally visit France, primarily to meet with surrealist artist André Breton. Jodorowsky continued his interest in surrealist art, and in 1962, he co-founded the Panic movement with Fernando Arrabal and Roland Topar, which would explore the ideas of absurdism. They never took themselves seriously and would laugh off any critics that did. While part of the group, he created the comic strip Annabelle 5, but soon after explored filmmaking again when he began working on Fondo Elise in 1967, based on a play by Fernando Arrabal. When the film premiered at the 1968 Acapulco Film Festival, it caused a massive riot for those who objected the film's content. It was also banned in Mexico. So it turns out people aren't really cool with religious symbols being paired up with incest and cannibalism. In 1970, Jodorowsky released his acid western El Topo.
El desierto es circular. Para encontrar a los cuatro maestros tendremos que viajar en espiral.
Which translates to The Mole, which he both directed and starred in. The movie told the story of a wandering Mexican bandit. Alejandro's character, he is in search of a spiritual enlightenment. My guess is that he drew inspiration from when he became a disciple of Zen Buddhist monk Ajo Takata in 1967. When Jodorowsky was asked to describe the film, he stated, quote, "I ask a film what most North Americans ask of psychedelic drugs. The difference being that when one creates a psychedelic film, he need not create a film that shows the visions of a person who has taken a pill. Rather, he needs to manufacture the pill."
That's a really interesting thing, because I have never partaken in psychedelic drugs, but I get the sense that in trying to replicate that experience in art, you don't do that by showing the same crazy images that you might see when you're doing those drugs. You figure out how you can use picture and sound and editing to replicate that feeling.
Yeah.
That's at least the sense that I get.
I do find it interesting that like both Jodorowsky and Herbert were experimenting with like Buddhism and like progressive thinking and
psychedelics.
psychedelics, and both got published at a very young age as well.
Yeah.
It's like he was made to make Dune. Although Jodorowsky was still living in Mexico and the film was about a Mexican bandit, he decided against releasing the film there after the backlash he faced when he released Fondo Elise. This forced him to start premiering his films in other countries like the United States. For several months, he would have El Topo play as a midnight movie at the Elgin Theater in New York City. It's widely believed that this was the beginning of the midnight cult movie phenomenon, which would have paved the way for movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space, Pink Flamingos, Night of the Living Dead, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Eraserhead, The Room, and so many more movies.
Yeah.
While the film was constantly selling out in New York, it actually caught the attention of John Lennon, and he loved the movie And because of that, he actually convinced his manager, Alan Klein, to help distribute the film all around the US.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. I'm so glad that I went down this rabbit hole because, like, what seems like random puzzle pieces are now, like, lining up and actually making sense as to why the manager of the Beatles is now a movie producer for this weird filmmaker.
Yeah, for sure.
Klein and Jodorowsky maintained their professional relationship, and Klein agreed to give $1 million to Jodorowsky's next film. That film being The Holy Mountain, released in 1973, and with much success.
Nothing in your education or experience can have prepared you for this film. Alejandro Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain.
In Italy, The Holy Mountain was actually number 2 in theaters, right behind James Bond.
Wow.
The movie was loosely inspired by René Dumal's surrealist novel Mount Analog. The main character is known as the Thief. This is the second thief character that we've encountered in this podcast. And he is also portrayed by Alejandro himself.
Yep.
The film follows the story of the thief, a mystical alchemist going through a religious training regimen of spiritual rebirth while making his way to the top of a holy mountain in search of the secret of immortality. While making the film, Jodorowsky received spiritual training from the Eureka School with Oscar Ichazo, who encouraged him to take LSD as Oscar guided him through the experience. He also experimented with isolation tanks conducted by John Lilly. This brings us back to where Klein and Jodorowsky split in 1974. Although Dune on its own is a huge undertaking, for Jodorowsky, he really wanted to make the movie his own and take many creative freedoms in order to put his own stamp on the film.
Yeah.
Now, these decisions weren't to make the film easier, faster, or more cost-effective. Instead, it did quite the opposite in every instance.
Yeah.
He wrote the script, which some would say was as thick as a phone book. And actually, if it was produced, it would probably be nearly 10 hours long. Jodorowsky began looking for artists to help create his vision. The first artist he got in contact in was Jean Giraud, aka Mobius. He chose him after discovering his comic book, Blueberry. Jodorowsky described Mobius as his, quote, camera. Now, according to Jodorowsky, remember this, unreliable narrator Jodorowsky, they met by chance when he went to his publicity agent to ask how he could work with him, and he just happened to be in the same building at the same time. So he's like, yeah, he's just down the hallway. Go ahead and meet him. Both Jodorowsky and Mobius, they sat down and created over 3,000 storyboard panels, laying out exactly what the film would look like. The film was going to be wildly ambitious from the technical standpoint. The opening shot was going to be a long oneer that would travel through the galaxy until we arrived on a golden planet where the frame of the story would begin. Now, the long oneer was inspired by Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, although this shot instantly reminded me of Ready Player One, directed by Steven Spielberg, where they're actually going through the virtual galaxy.
Oh, interesting. I feel like this is a kind of shot that's been done a ton. I was thinking of Limitless and how that starts with the infinite zoom, but it's got that infinite zoom shot of just going through the city. Yeah.
I have this Mandela effect memory that they used the shot in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, probably. I feel like it's something that's been done a lot now, especially in, the age of digital effects where we can do all sorts of things. It's interesting that he compares it to Touch of Evil, which I guess would have been like the only long one take, but I feel like Jodorowsky was doing a different kind of opening one take that we see now of the endless zoom in, whereas Touch of Evil is like a long one take establishing a story, or in the case of Touch of Evil, that's more about just like building suspense because it shows you a bomb at the beginning of the shot and then you're just watching this car drive that has a bomb in it and you're just waiting to see what'll happen. And that's the kind of storytelling one take that you see in something more like Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights has the long moving camera to establish all the characters and stuff, but This is something that feels like very specific to kind of the ideas of space or the ideas of being kind of like endless possibility that establishes a different kind of a tone.
Yeah. And I think the thing that he got out of it the most was the fact that it was not only a one shot, but the camera is moving during the one shot. And I think that's what he got out of it. I keep thinking back to like older films because the amount of cuts that are in films nowadays is like exponentially higher than older films. In a lot of older films, they would set the camera down and basically just capture the action or as much of that action in that one take. But the thing is that the camera was stationary. And with Touch of Evil, it was the first time that you could realize that you could actually use the camera, move it around, and still have that continuous action happening in front of the camera. And I think that's what he was getting from that.
Yes.
You do have to keep in mind that this is around 1974, 75, so Star Wars wasn't even a thing yet. Jodorowsky was looking for someone that could handle the visual effects, which could match his wild vision. Now, the only film before that was near this visual and technically difficult was 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's who they turned to for creating these intense visual effects. The special effects supervisor of 2001 was Douglas Trumbull. He and his crew went to LA to find him, but Trumbull refused to work with them. According to Jodorowsky, he called him about 40 times trying to get a conversation with him, but he was rejected every time. Trumbull was very technical when it came to his workflow, and when he worked with Kubrick, he was given a lot of freedom to do what he knew what he was capable of. Yeah. So Trumbull didn't want to be tasked with the visual effects he knew he could not handle had he joined the film. Basically, it was just setting himself up for failure, and he did not want to get into that territory.
Yeah, I can definitely respect that decision.
Yeah. But according to Jodorowsky, he turned down Trumbull because he was not his, quote, spiritual warrior.
Yes.
The search continued for the next special effects artist, and another one they found was when Jodorowsky watched John Carpenter's Dark Star.
Dark Star. 20 years in space, 1 million light years from Earth. Their job is to clear a path for the colonization of space.
And their special effects supervisor, Dan O'Bannon. Dark Star started off as a student short film which was written by Dan O'Bannon and John Carpenter while they were attending USC, and it cost them about $6,000 to make. It was then picked up and turned into a full-length feature for about $6 million, which launched the careers of Carpenter and O'Bannon. Yep. They scheduled a meeting, and before doing so, O'Bannon wanted to know what he was getting himself into. He did his research and watched Jodorowsky's previous films and was expecting this wild-eyed, crazy-dressed artist. Instead, when he met him, he was met with a very clean-cut, suit-wearing, shaved, and combed Alejandro.
And then he got to know him and was like, oh, yeah, no, you definitely are the guy who made those movies.
Yes. But yeah, he was shocked with how professional he presented himself. Although the meeting did get weird when Jodorowsky pulled out a folded up newspaper and said that inside was very special marijuana. Needless to say, they smoked it, and there was definitely something else in there because O'Bannon described the rest of the meeting where he felt very relaxed.
All I remember is I was getting incredibly relaxed and that I was looking straight into his eyes. When all of a sudden, at the conclusion of a sentence, he said, like this, and wham, out from his face shot these radiating lines of patterns, which proceeded to produce around his head a circular, shimmering mandala or kaleidoscope-like pattern with his face in the center and his eyes fixed on mine and the rest of the room vanishing into oblivion. And then he relaxed all of his features, the eyes, which had been staring into mine like something supernatural, all of a sudden relaxed down the head. Lids came down and the face smiled and it changed back. The 20 years came back onto his face. And the hallucinative visual effect and the mental effect dispersed immediately. Just blink. And I was completely dazzled. I was dazed at the experience.
So after the meeting, Dan was eager to join the film. Jodorowsky told O'Bannon, quote, "Now sell everything you own, come to Paris, prepare to have your life changed. And for the next 6 months, O'Bannon was living in Paris.
When I heard that moment in the documentary, that story told, it was just like, Jodorowsky just thinks he's Jesus right now.
He does.
Go sell all your things and follow me. Like, that's such an interesting thing. And like Jodorowsky's perception of a Messiah character versus Herbert's perception of a Messiah character, and how that ties into anything. It was really strange to hear that line, knowing the direction of the story that Jodorowsky is going to go in how Paul is written in his version of Dune.
Over the course of our break, I got into a new podcast called Sounds Like a Cult.
Great name.
They're basically taking these weird cultural phenomenons. They will take something like CrossFit, for example, and they try to break down like, okay, is it really a cult? Is it not a cult? And like, what are the aspects that we look at it and what makes it a cult?
Interesting. Like, what are the things that they are doing that are similar to what a cult is doing to keep people part of the system?
Yeah, and this is kind of what I'm seeing with Jodorowsky, is that whenever he meets someone, he immediately empowers them and says, like, you are the greatest at doing this. Or like, he builds them up so much right from the beginning. They don't even seem to be discussing payment or anything like that. He's like, you are a fabulous artist, the greatest in the world. And I think you can help me create the greatest movie in the world. And we even saw this in the documentary as well, where he's like, I'm going to change the world.
Yeah.
We're going to change the world with this.
It's a cult of personality.
Yeah. He's not even describing a movie anymore. It's like he's describing a movement.
Yeah.
I can see why, like, these artists are, like, getting enamored by this. Like, it doesn't feel like they're taking on a job anymore. They're like, this idea of being part of something bigger than themselves, they're immediately clinging on to it. And that's a very desirable need.
Yeah.
So I absolutely get it. The search continued to get more people, or spiritual warriors, on board, which includes the cast. Now, Jodorowsky really enjoyed the show Kung Fu, which he claims was a partial influence for his film El Topo. The show starred David Carradine, and Jodorowsky thought he'd be perfect for portraying the character Duke Leto. After having a meeting with Carradine, who supposedly consumed about $60 worth of vitamin E that Jodorowsky offered him with the intent that he would have just one pill a day to help keep up his strength. After that encounter, Alejandro knew that he was perfect for the role. Originally, Jodorowsky was going to take on the role himself, but he felt that he was too busy with the film already and had to pass on the role to someone else. Next to cast was the prophet Paul. Well, the only other child actor that he's worked with was actually his son, Brunch, who was 6 at the time that they were filming El Topo, and at the time of pre-production for Dune, he was 12 years old. Now, keep in mind, Kyle MacLachlan and Timothée Chalamet, both of them were around 24 years old when they portrayed Paul in the movies. In the book, he's actually supposed to be 15, and described by his mother, he looks smaller for a 15-year-old.
Sounds like the way Hollywood makes movies.
Which, I mean, looking at it now, I don't know how I feel about Timothée Chalamet. Maybe it's kind of how I feel about like Robert Pattinson back when he was like in his Twilight days. Looking at it now, he kind of is the perfect casting for it.
Yeah.
Because if he's supposed to be 15, he's young, he's scrawny. But also, you need someone who's over 18 years old, or like old enough where they can be on set for a lot longer and not have to deal with the child labor laws.
Yeah.
He has a better discipline about himself. So I understand now why they would cast Timothée Chalamet in that role. Over time, like, I'm starting to accept it now. And I'm not really seeing the Timothée Chalamet that I'm kind of over. And now I'm really seeing the character Paul instead.
Yeah. I do get the sense that part of the reason that Paul is so young in the books is because he is meant to be impressionable and, in a sense, easily manipulated, especially by his parents. Because if you think about his father's goal of establishing his family's place in the empire and his mother's goal of bringing about this religious prophecy, having somebody who is young and easily manipulated by that definitely makes sense to what it seems to me is the way the character is written. But the movie is still doing a good enough job at You don't necessarily have to be a young person to be interested in your parents' ambitions, but
yeah.
Yeah.
So for Jodorowsky, it wasn't just enough that they were going to throw Brontes in front of the camera. He actually had to prepare for this role. So he had to learn karate, acrobatics, and he had to develop his mind. So Brontes began his training with a stunt coordinator, Jean-Pierre Vignot, for 6 hours a day, for 7 days a week, for 2 years. A controversial decision that Alejandro still questions to this day if he did the right thing. The one thing that I love about the documentary is that after they said for how long he trained, they immediately cut to Brontes in his talking head. And he's like, that hurt. That hurt a lot. Jodorowsky wanted to make sure that all the fighting in the film felt authentic and even hired an unknown guerrilla warfare expert from South Africa who fought in Bolivia, Chile, Peru, and many parts of Central America to work on the film as a consultant. I tried looking for this guy's name, but they kept it pretty well hidden, which is why I say unknown guerrilla warfare expert. Jodorowsky and the team discovered another artist to join the crew, Chris Foss. Now, Foss was recognized for his artwork on sci-fi book covers. He could design and illustrate these fantastical pieces of architecture, vehicles, and spaceships. The thing that Jodorowsky was drawn to was the fact that the spaceships and vehicles were made to look like other creatures, like bugs and birds, and they looked as if they were alive. If you recall from the film, the Thopter resembles a dragonfly. Foss, who is from England, came to France and had a meeting with Jodorowsky. Alejandro didn't make the best first impression because he immediately started going through Chris's bag, thinking that it was his girlfriend's. After the meeting, they had him watch The Holy Mountain. Also a strange start because it's such a bizarre film. The other thing that made his illustrations unique was that before Foss was an artist, he actually studied architecture. So even in his designs, like the Emperor's Palace, even though it seemed bizarre and far-fetched, it was still plausible that the build would actually function, like the building would actually function. Casting continued, and for Jodorowsky, he wanted someone to take on the grand character of the Emperor of the Galaxy, Padishah Saddam IV. And who better to personify this grand character than artist Salvador Dali? Jodorowsky and Michael Sado happened to be in New York City at the St. Regis Hotel. Now, again, according to Jodorowsky, Salvador Dali coincidentally was staying at the very same hotel at the same time. Jodorowsky wanted to meet with him, so he tore a page out of his Toro book that he was reading, which happened to have a hanging man illustrated on the other side. And on the back of that, he wrote down and asked if he could meet and talk to him about the film. Dali gladly accepted the invitation. They met at the hotel bar where Dali said that he will meet him again in Paris, and he will think about joining the film. In Paris, they met at the Champs-Élysées, where Dali was surrounded by his court, basically just a posse of a dozen people. The conversation that Jodorowsky claims that they had was that Dali had asked him,
when we was young, myself and Picasso, we went to the beach, and we opened the door of the car. Always in the sun, we find a clock, un reloj clock, no? Do you find in your life a clock in the sun?
Jodorowsky, he was under a lot of pressure. He had to answer in a way that would satisfy Dali, and he had to say something quickly. So he replied with,
I never find a clock, but I lost a lot.
After that, Dali agreed to be part of the film. It also helped that both of them, Jodorowsky and Dali, were both part of the Surrealist movement. So I think there's because we're on the same team, we can do this.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Salvador Dali's film, Un Chien Andalo?
I have not.
It's a weird movie, but you could definitely see how the type of person who made that movie would be excited to work with somebody who makes El Topo or Mountain of God.
Dali had to be aware of what Jodorowsky was doing, and he was just kind of playing with him just a little bit to be like, are you the real thing? And then once he found out, he's like, all right, I'll play along with this.
This level of surrealist movement. There are some movies that I think could be described as surrealist that I am really into. My favorite movie is a movie called It's Such a Beautiful Day, which is this really bizarre animated movie. I feel like I don't connect as much with a lot of the surrealist stuff at the time. What Jodorowsky was talking about here does not seem like something I personally would be into, because it seems like it has so much to do with aesthetics. You know, how do we create this wild visuals? How do we make something look like this and use that aesthetic to create a feeling, and that feeling is what the art is. Where I feel like a lot of the stuff that I'm more into, like It's Such a Beautiful Day, feels like it's got a very different focus. It's not just about the aesthetic visuals. It's more about like, okay, how do I create these bizarre moments of storytelling and make that kind of convey a theme, and dialogue that is unconventional and situations that are unconventional. And so it's interesting to me where this being so purely about aesthetics, to the point where I don't get the sense that that's what Frank Herbert is into either. At least his view of storytelling. Like, it doesn't strike me that Frank Herbert was into that same kind of visual surrealism. His stories are so much more grounded in, or at least from my sense, so much more grounded in politics and in the way that groups of people interact and the way history is created. There's some ways where it's like Jodorowsky's vision can convey what Dune is doing in a different way. And then there's a lot of ways where it's so different. And like, Jodorowsky, you are doing your own thing and you're just calling it Dune.
Yeah. With science fiction, it seems like it's always theme first, or like theme headed.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Such a Beautiful Day. The thing that I notice about that movie is that so much of the theme is up front, and that's what carries the movie forward. And it's basically creating a world, which is a very odd and weird world, in which you can jump around through the story. And by creating this world, it makes sense that you jump from here to here to here.
Yeah. Because it's all painting a picture of this character and his struggles, and how you as an audience member can relate to those struggles, and how the absurdity of existence feels. That's kind of how I feel about that movie, is it feels like it's about the absurdity of existence, but it's not telling that through crazy visuals necessarily.
No, everything is like to serve the purpose of the theme.
Yes, yes.
We're still on Dali because he is he's quite the character in real life. At the time, Salvador Dali's muse was Amanda Lear. She tried her best to tame down Dali and also warn Jodorowsky of his reckless actions. Jodorowsky appreciated the gesture, and with her being around so much, he was actually cast in the role of Princess Irulan. So Dali, after saying yes to the film, started making ridiculous commands, and Jodorowsky was stuck in a position where he just had to say yes, or he was going to lose him. He wanted a helicopter that would transport him to and from set. The scene that he was in, he wanted to have a burning giraffe. During the scenes, he wanted to be sitting on a giant toilet that looked like two dolphins, one of them to receive urine, the other one to receive feces. And he wanted to feature a close-up, which would have been done by a double. Dali also refused to take any directions. He would not follow the script, and he wanted to do whatever he wanted. The cherry on top, which most people know about, was his desire to be the best paid actor in Hollywood.
The way it's portrayed in the documentary doesn't even seem like Salvador Dali is interested in the money. It seems like he's more interested in the clout or just the absurdity of that title of being the best paid actor in Hollywood.
Yeah, it seemed like he was just trying to be absurd in every single decision that he was going to make.
Yes.
And that's kind of his MO for everything. Basically, his life seems like this art form.
Yeah.
Of absurdity. He wanted to be paid $100,000 per hour. Obviously, there was no way of controlling how long Dali would be on set. Jodorowsky and his producer, Michael Sadu, proposed that instead, he would be paid $100,000 per minute used in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Dali agreed to that like he was winning the lottery. Now, the Emperor is a significant part in the movie. This film was going to be extremely long. So Sadu asked Jodorowsky how many minutes Dali would occupy in the film, and he replied with about 5 minutes maximum, maybe 3. There's another contradicting story about the different counteroffer where the production agreed to $100,000 per hour, but Jodorowsky reduced his time to being on set for 1 hour. To work around the Emperor being in the rest of the film, the plan was to make a mold of Dali's head and create a robot that would be paraded around as the Emperor. And this would be used for a majority of the film.
With the deal to do $100,000 a minute, I get the sense that Salvador Dali was excited, not because he was tricked that he wasn't going to get as much money. Again, it wasn't about the money for him. I think he just loved the way that sounded of being like, yes, I'm going to get $100,000 per minute. I mean, isn't that what Arnold Schwarzenegger did with Mr. Freeze?
I know he got paid a lot, and his screen time is like less than 10 minutes in the film.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just that when you do the math, it's like he basically made $1 million for each minute of screen time.
The other one is Mark Hamill in The Force Awakens, where he's literally in the film for maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Does not say a word and got paid like, do you know how much he got paid for that? It was like,
I don't know how much he got paid for it, but
I remember it was just like an absurd amount.
It's so interesting because it's like Mark Hamill is not the type of person you think of who even would be asking for a massive fee. I feel like knowing the marketing of that movie and J.J. Abrams' whole thing, that marketing of that movie was built around everybody asking where Luke Skywalker is. I feel like it was almost done to keep people off of the scent that he's not going to show up until the very, very end.
Yeah. Okay, it's not that much, but it's still like, it was more than Daisy Ridley and John Boyega got, but he got $30 million for that segment. I mean, yes, $3 million is a lot of money for what he did, but it's not as absurd as I thought it was. So yeah, back to Dali. So like with the robot thing, to justify this in the story, they had to come up with this like side B story saying that the Emperor was so afraid of getting assassinated that he would actually have a robot act in his place.
Honestly, makes perfect sense. I feel like you don't need to explain that any farther. I get it. Emperor is scared to lose his life. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after the movie was done, Dali requested that the robot that they made in his image be put in his museum, which Jodorowsky gladly agreed to because, I mean, what else is he going to do with it afterwards? While Dali was signed into the film, he actually showed Jodorowsky a catalog of one of Dali's favorite artists, H.R. Giger. Jodorowsky immediately fell in love with his work and thought he'd be perfect to design the villains, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and his empire.
I'm sorry, did we ever talk about, because we've talked about H.R. Giger before.
Yes, we have. In Isobar is when we did it, the train.
Yes. Did I ever talk about the podcast Superego during that?
No.
There's a podcast called Superego, which is a improv comedy thing where they just have like a whole bunch of improv bits. But one of their recurring things is an H.R. Giger impression.
Sweetheart, did your father sign the permission slip?
No. Your mother got out of her whalebone cage.
Yes, the kitchen. H, he needs 2 signatures on this permission slip or he can't go.
Son?
Yeah, Dad?
No, I was speaking to the actual heliotropic body.
I'll just let myself out.
I hate you.
It's like a recurring character of his, H.R. Giger, which is fantastic. And I always think of like his weird accent and the weird things he does.
H.R. Giger, when you hear him talk, he's like almost like a high-pitched, raspy, Swedish accent.
First was Jodorowsky. He was in Dali's home and they wanted me for doing Dune.
Matt Gorley is the
yes.
name I was trying to think of.
So for H.R. Giger, he had never been involved with movies. And it's almost hard to imagine him now not being part of the film industry that wasn't influenced by him today. But it was Jodorowsky that convinced Giger that his art needs to be in movies.
Yeah, he was right about that.
Oh, yeah. When Giger arrived in Paris, he was treated to a concert to see the gothic band Magma. Magma signed on to the film to provide the music for the Harkonnens because their music was dark, gothic, and violent. Jodorowsky had a plan to use different rock bands to score the film to give each character or a group of people a unique sound. Like for the Duke Leto, they managed to sign on Pink Floyd to provide background music for that character. This was right after they finished recording the album Dark Side of the Moon. Other bands that were rumored to have joined the film were Gong, Mike Oldfield, and Tangerine Dream, all of which were signed with Virgin Records. It didn't seem to stop there. Jodorowsky wanted a rock star to be part of the picture, and at the time, the biggest rock star was Mick Jagger, who was cast to portray Fade Rutha in the David Lynch movie that was actually taken over by Sting, another rock star.
When this showed up in the documentary on the Jodorowsky being an unreliable narrator, that was like, this does not seem true, to the point where I even have my suspicions of whether or not Mick Jagger was ever actually signed on to the picture for real.
Yeah, because I'm actually going to go into this story next about him being an unreliable narrator, because according to Jodorowsky, he was invited to an event in Paris, an exclusive party of the upper echelon, where he spotted Mick Jagger from the opposite end of the room. Jagger then walked across the room to Jodorowsky, and Jodorowsky said to him, "I want you in my movie," and Mick responded with a simple yes.
Sure.
There's a somewhat plausible explanation to this, because Jodorowsky had so many deep connections in the art world. It pretty much seemed typical that he would be invited to many of the events held by artists like Andy Warhol. Actually, at one of Andy Warhol's events, that's where he met Odu Kier, which he wanted him to play Peter De Vries.
Maybe Mick Jagger saw Jodorowsky and was just like, I want to stick one to John Lennon by getting into a Jodorowsky movie.
Yes. Actually, that does kind of make sense. For the Baron Harkonnen, Jodorowsky wanted Orson Welles.
This is like the most perfect, obvious casting. I remember watching the 2021 movie, and when Baron Harkonnen was on screen, I was like, this feels like Orson Welles. This feels like this is a character for either Orson Welles or late Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
It makes all of the sense in the world that he would be casting Orson Welles for this.
But the problem is that Orson Welles did not want to be an actor anymore.
Yeah.
It seemed like he was producing some stuff, but it seemed like he was really just out of the filmmaking game altogether at this point.
When was the Muppet movie? The Muppet movie, I think, might have been a couple of years after this.
I think.
Because that's my favorite Orson Welles appearance.
1979. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That was a little while after this.
Yeah. I guess they convinced him to get back in.
Just in time for him to show up in the Transformers movie.
Yeah. So Orson Welles, he was known for loving food and drinking. So to meet up with him by chance, he had his secretary ask around to all the restaurants in Paris where Orson Welles liked to eat. They managed to find a restaurant that he likes, and Jodorowsky was determined to meet him. He met up with one of the chefs and asked for Welles' favorite bottle of wine and sent it to him. After drinking the bottle, he was open to speaking with Jodorowsky. Orson Welles right away was not interested in acting, or at least being in front of the camera. Jodorowsky had to offer him something right away to change his mind. So he offered to still pay him as an actor, but on top of that, he would hire the chef at this very restaurant, and he would cook him every single meal that he was on set. And after which, Orson Welles agreed to do the picture. Other casting included Charlotte Rampling as Lady Jessica, although she did turn down the role. Gloria Swanson was cast as the Reverend Mother Gais Helen Mohiam. I can see why you read in this book, you're just like, I don't understand any of this. There's Alain Delon as the Duncan Idaho, and Hervé Villechaz as the Gurney Halleck. Hervé is known from Fantasy Island. Typically on this podcast, we like to go through a synopsis of the script's plot, but with the books and the movies that are already out there, I didn't want to repeat what has already been known.
Yeah.
What I would like to go through is the moments in Jodorowsky's scripts that may have deviated from Frank Herbert's novel and scenes that would have made the film truly unique.
Yes.
We mentioned before that there is the long oneer that would have traveled through the galaxy, although not confirmed. But from DuneInfo.com, it seems like the original opening of the film was going to start on a planet inhabited by intelligently advanced canine creatures using robot exoskeletons to move around. The Galaxy one-shot was added to lead up to this planet. Now, on the dog planet, we follow the inhabitants to the theater where a large crucifix robot projects from its eyes a film about the history of humanity. This acts as a visual prologue to the film. In it, we learn that the Earth was destroyed over 20,000 years ago, but man had managed to populate multiple planets in the galaxy. There is a revolution against machines in which cause a restriction against AI, wars, and atomic weapons. We learn about the spice and its effects and the history of the Bene Gesserit and the rise of the Padishah Empire. When the story properly begins, we follow Duke Leto in investigating an underground spice smuggling ring and discovers the Harkonnens are responsible, and Leto informs the Emperor of their involvement. But he is unaware that the Emperor is also involved in the illegal smuggling, so to avoid any suspicion, he gives control of Arrakis and the mining of spice to the House Atreides.
This definitely seems like a big deviation, that spice is an illegal drug and being treated like an illegal drug in this.
I don't think it's really that, but it's more the illegal smuggling of it. It's kind of like how there's a black market for maple syrup in Canada and how that's a big problem, where the substance is legal, but the means of getting that substance is illegal.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Mm-hmm. As the Duke prepares his move to Arrakis, there is a flashback that shows that Leto was castrated in battle, and for a son to be conceived, a drop of blood had to be taken from Leto, and then Lady Jessica was able to take that blood and through her powers use that to impregnate herself.
This whole thing, that sure is something Jodorowsky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for Jodorowsky, he viewed Paul as the result of spiritual pleasure and not one of physical pleasure.
He really, really wants to be telling that Messiah story.
Yeah, he does. It's not even with Jesus, but like many multiple messiahs.
Yeah.
A lot of their origin stories are of the virgin birth. And this is just another one of those.
Yes.
When the Duke meets up with the Emperor, the scene, which is storyboarded by Mobius, the Emperor is inside of a upside-down room where only the human bodies seem to abide by the laws of gravity, but everything else, the room, the furniture, a giraffe, all appear to be upside down. Even their clothes and hair are inclined to fall upwards. When the Emperor is finished with Leto, the room spins very fast and ejects Leto out of a clown's bottom. There's a scene where the Atreides are throwing a ball in which the first floor is separated into 4 different sections. The first section contains the rich industrial class along with 50 generals where they're all tormenting 3 beggar children. The second are Fremen who are listening to music, playing a giant game of chess. The spice searchers are in the 3rd room where there's just a lot of drinking and mischief. And the 4th room containing the smugglers is the most Jodorowsky-esque. There are torch jugglers, women turning, hanging by the neck, bears disguised as clowns performing wire acrobatics, a donkey wearing a hat with a placard that reads Raven the Beast, half-naked women behaving like pets, wearing gloves with claws and false tails. There's a hippopotamus in the center of the room where men are taking turns wrestling it. I would love to see this movie. After the Harkonnens slaughter the Atreides, the Harkonnen soldiers are ordered to defecate on the floor of the palace. And Jodorowsky was planning on actually filming nearly 2,000 extras shitting on the floor.
Yep.
Sure. For Baron Harkonnen's castle, it was imagined that it was going to be a giant sculpture of the Baron himself, and at the top was a scaled-up replica of his head, and the only entrance was through the mouth. This was initially drawn by Mobius, but then was reimagined by H.R. Giger. Now, images of that concept art we're actually going to post to our socials, but if you do want to check this out, duneinfo.com is the website to go to, or you could just simply do a Google search for this, but it is really cool. It's one of the most famous H.R. Giger sketches, easily one of the most famous sketches out there. In the end, Paul, who is known as Muad'Dib, leads the Fremen into the battle against the Harkonnen. When the battle is nearly over, Paul has a one-on-one duel with the Fade Rutha. The ending of the script is different from what was storyboarded. In the script, Paul kills Fade and is poisoned during the battle. Fenring is then ordered by the Emperor to kill Paul, but he doesn't, knowing that the action would make him a martyr. The Emperor goes and kills him himself, but in the storyboards, Paul's throat is cut open immediately. The Fremen and all of Paul's closest followers become a collective man. All their eyes light up blue, and they all speak in Paul's voice, saying, I am Muad'Dib. In the script, it cuts to an epilogue, but in the storyboard, the planet transforms into a lush green. Plants begin to grow, animals appear, a blue ring forms around the planet. The shot zooms out, and Arrakis travels through the galaxy, like in the opening shot, to enlighten the other planets, and we're back on the Canine planet, where the history of humanity film has just ended. The head of the projector explodes. Sure. The canine beings leave the theater knowing that their masters will never return. But they get into the spaceship hoping they find him. In later revisions of the script, the canine planet was cut, and in the book, Arrakis never changes.
This whole thing, Paul becoming, the consciousness of many, and the world of Dune, Arrakis turning into this lush green planet, again, tying in with that messianic story of this magical person who's going to change the universe. It also seems to fly in the face of the actual themes of Dune. It seems like a big part of Dune and the story of Paul Atreides is a deconstruction of a Messiah story, in that Paul is this Messiah figure and is supposed to be a Messiah specifically to the Fremen, but it turns out to be that he is simply a tool of colonialism, and the whole Messiah story is a tool to basically get the Fremen to stand down and give up their spice to the Empire in the guise of being their own free people. From what I've seen and heard about what the direction and the themes that Dune goes into, this kind of ending is not Frank Herbert's intention, and is not the intention of Dune, because it is basically saying that the Messiah story is a good thing.
Yeah. Watching the movie, both of them, and this interpretation, Paul feels more like a white savior.
Yes.
Than someone who's there to really change the world.
Yes.
If the Fremen are so resourceful and he is learning so much from the Fremen, there could have been an interesting story to tell. Have you ever watched Miracle Workers?
I have not.
There's a season where they're doing the Oregon Trail.
Okay.
And Steve Buscemi, basically his character, he's known as being this famous bandit.
Okay.
And he gets captured by Native Americans, in which the Native Americans now have to fight off basically the U.S. government, or an army that's trying to get them off of their land. Mm-hmm. And Steve Buscemi sees himself as oh, cool, I'm the person here that can help fight off these people. And for the Native Americans, they're just we know what we're doing. We've fought battles before. We don't need you around. And he's no. I'm here to save you. I see what my purpose is. And in every instance during the battle, he is failing. He can't do anything. And he realizes that his purpose in the battle is not really as a fighter, but then becomes a hype man for everyone else in the battle. It's pretty great. So when Frank Herbert commented on the script, he was quoted saying in Ed Naha's 1984 book, he said that Jodorowsky's script was pretty anti-Catholic too. I used to kid Alejandro about that. I told him that the biggest disappointment in writing the script was probably not finding a way to horsewhip the Pope in it. Unfortunately, this is the end of part 1 for Dune. There was just too much information to cover in just one episode. Join us next week when we discuss the downfall of Jodorowsky's Dune, how David Lynch ended up directing the movie, how Dune still lives on within cinema, the story of the 2 Dune video games being made at the same time by the same company, the TV series, and how we got the Denis Villeneuve movies today.
Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. If you want to find more episodes of this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcasts.com, which is where you can also find Come On Fahuguapods, The Mystery Shack Look Back, and Escape from Vault Disney. While you're there, you can find links to all of our social media pages. We are on Twitter at HDTNGM, and we are on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. And you can send us your emails with suggestions, corrections, or just musings about Dune. You can send those emails to notgetmade@gmail.com. We also have a Patreon page. We're so thankful for the donations we get on Patreon. You can get access to the Button Club, to special monthly bonus episodes where oftentimes talk about movies that were made.
Yes.
A lot of that kind of talk happening there. So if you like the movie talk and you want to hear our hot takes on whatever the latest release is, subscribing to our Patreon's a great place to hear that.
It is, yes.
That's going to wrap us up. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Bye-bye.
Dan, you just froze for me. I just heard they were the only 2 students, and now you're frozen, and I cannot hear anything. Something's going on with the internet. I don't know if it's me. Well, Dan's computer crashed. I heard they were the only 2 students. The only 2 students who what? The only 2 students who knew how to make a roast beef sandwich. The only 2 students whose middle name was Frambalam. The only 2 students who ate pies. The only 2 students who what?